In just 63 seconds, a freshman congresswoman was about to dismantle decades of judicial arrogance with a precision that would leave a Supreme Court justice speechless. Judge Samuel Alito sat in that chamber with a smirk on his face, confident, untouchable, draped in the impenetrable armor of lifetime appointment. He'd faced down senators, survived confirmation battles, and written opinions that shaped American law for generations. But he wasn't prepared for Jasmine Crockett. The cameras were rolling. The chamber was packed. And what happened next would break the internet, spawn 1,000 reaction videos, and fundamentally change how America views the relationship between elected representatives and the judicial elite who claim to serve them. This is the story of 63 seconds that exposed everything. To understand why those 63 seconds mattered, you need to understand who Samuel Alito is, who Jasmine Crockett is, and why their collision was inevitable. Samuel Alito was nominated to the Supreme Court in 2005 by President George W. Bush. His confirmation hearings were contentious but ultimately successful. He replaced Justice Sandra Day O'Connor, the first woman on the Supreme Court and a moderate conservative who often served as the crucial swing vote on divisive issues. Alito was different. Alito was a conservative's conservative. Over his years on the bench, Alito became known for his originalist interpretation of the Constitution, his skepticism of abortion rights, his expansive view of gun rights, and his generally conservative judicial philosophy. He wrote the majority opinion in Dobbs v. Jackson Women's Health Organization, the decision that overturned Roe v. Wade and eliminated the constitutional right to abortion that had existed for nearly 50 years. That decision alone made him one of the most controversial figures in American public life. But Alito also developed a reputation for something else: arrogance, a dismissive attitude toward criticism, a tendency to lecture rather than listen, and an apparent belief that Supreme Court justices exist in a realm beyond accountability, beyond questioning, beyond the messy democratic processes that govern everyone else. There were the ethics scandals, reports of luxury fishing trips with billionaire Republican donors, undisclosed gifts, flights on private jets, homes purchased under questionable circumstances, the kind of behavior that would end any other public servant's career, but which seemed to bounce off Supreme Court justices like rubber bullets off a tank. When questioned about these issues, Alito didn't apologize. He didn't even really explain. He simply asserted that Supreme Court justices weren't bound by the same ethics rules as other federal judges, and that the American people should trust his judgment about what was appropriate. It was the judicial equivalent of, "because I said so." And for years, it worked. Because what could anyone really do about it? Supreme Court justices serve for life. They can't be voted out. Impeachment requires a 2/3 Senate majority, which is virtually impossible in modern polarized America. They are, for all practical purposes, untouchable. Alito knew this. You could see it in how he carried himself, in how he responded to criticism, in the barely concealed contempt with which he regarded those who questioned his decisions or his conduct. Now let's talk about Jasmine Crockett. Representative Jasmine Crockett was elected to Congress in 2022, representing Texas's 30th congressional district, which includes parts of Dallas and its suburbs. She was a civil rights attorney before entering politics, someone who'd spent years fighting in courtrooms on behalf of people who couldn't fight for themselves. She was young, black, a woman, and she didn't come from money or political dynasty. She earned her position by outworking, out-organizing, and out-campaigning her opponents. She won because voters in her district were tired of the same old political class and wanted someone who would actually fight for them. Crockett quickly gained a reputation in Congress. She wasn't there to make friends with the establishment. She wasn't interested in the genteel clubhouse atmosphere of congressional courtesy where everyone pretends to respect each other while backstabbing behind closed doors. She was there to get things done and to call out corruption, hypocrisy, and abuse of power wherever she found it. This made her extremely popular with her constituents and with progressive activists nationwide. It also made her many enemies among the old guard who preferred the traditional way of doing things, where freshman members stayed quiet, deferred to senior members, and gradually learned to play the game. Crockett refused to play the game. She'd already had several viral moments. A heated exchange with Representative Marjorie Taylor Greene that showcased her quick wit and refusal to back down from bullies. Sharp questioning of witnesses in committee hearings that revealed contradictions and evasions other members missed. A rhetorical style that combined legal precision with street-smart directness. People loved watching her work because she said what millions of Americans were thinking but rarely heard from their elected officials. So when it was announced that Supreme Court justices would be testifying before Congress about ethics reform and accountability measures, everyone who'd been paying attention knew that Jasmine Crockett would have something to say. And everyone who knew Samuel Alito's track record knew he wouldn't take kindly to being questioned by a freshman Congresswoman. The collision was inevitable. The only question was what would happen when an unstoppable force of democratic accountability met the immovable object of judicial arrogance. The hearing was scheduled for a Tuesday morning in late September. The chamber was packed with press, congressional staff, legal experts, and citizens who'd lined up for hours to get one of the limited public seats. This wasn't a normal hearing. Supreme Court justices rarely testify before Congress. The separation of powers doctrine generally keeps the judicial and legislative branches at arm's length, interacting through formal written communications rather than face-to-face questioning. But the ethics scandals had reached a breaking point. Poll after poll showed that public confidence in the Supreme Court had collapsed to historic lows. A majority of Americans now believed the court was motivated more by partisan politics than by law or justice. Congress, responding to public pressure, had proposed various ethics reform bills. Some would create an enforceable code of conduct for Supreme Court justices. Others would establish an independent inspector general to investigate complaints. Still others would impose term limits or create a mandatory retirement age. The justices, predictably, opposed all of these measures. They argued that Congress lacked the constitutional authority to regulate the court's internal operations, and that any such attempt would violate the separation of powers. But public pressure was mounting, and several justices, including Alito, had agreed to testify to explain their position and hopefully defuse the crisis. Alito arrived at the Capitol that morning in a motorcade, surrounded by Supreme Court police and U.S. Marshals. He looked calm, even bored, as he entered the hearing room. He'd prepared extensively with a team of clerks and constitutional scholars. He had his talking points memorized. He was ready to lecture Congress on why they needed to back off and leave the Supreme Court alone. What he wasn't ready for was Jasmine Crockett. The hearing began with opening statements from the committee chairman and ranking member. Both were carefully worded, respectful, almost obsequious in their treatment of the justices. This was, after all, unprecedented. Members of Congress generally don't want to appear to be attacking the Supreme Court, even when they disagree with its decisions. But the deference felt wrong to anyone watching. Here were elected representatives, chosen by the people, acting like supplicants before appointed officials who served for life and increasingly seemed to believe they were above the law. The early questioning was softball. Members asked general questions about judicial independence and ethics. Alito gave rehearsed answers about the importance of public trust and the court's commitment to the highest standards of conduct, while carefully avoiding any specific commitments or admissions of wrongdoing. He was comfortable, in control. He'd done this kind of thing before during his confirmation hearings, and he knew how to run out the clock, give vague answers, and avoid anything that could be used against him later. Then it was Jasmine Crockett's turn. She'd been sitting quietly throughout the earlier questioning, taking notes, watching Alito carefully. She'd noticed his body language, the slight smirk when he disagreed with a question's premise, the way he talked down to members who challenged him, the condescension that dripped from his carefully chosen words. She'd also noticed something else. He wasn't taking her seriously. When the chairman recognized her for her 5 minutes of questioning, Alito visibly relaxed. His expression said it all. A freshman congresswoman, what could she possibly ask that would trouble him? He'd faced down seasoned senators, brilliant legal minds, hostile journalists. This would be easy. He was smiling when she began speaking. He wouldn't be smiling for long. Crockett started with a simple question, her voice calm and measured. Justice Alito, You've said that Supreme Court justices aren't bound by the same code of conduct that applies to all other federal judges. Is that correct? Alito nodded. The Supreme Court is constitutionally distinct from lower courts. We operate under different principles and constraints. So you're above the rules that apply to everyone else. I wouldn't put it that way. We're simply governed by different standards appropriate to our unique constitutional role. Different standards, Crockett repeated, letting the words hang in the air. Let me ask you about those standards. In 2008, you went on a luxury fishing trip to Alaska with Paul Singer, a billionaire hedge fund manager who had cases before the Supreme Court. You didn't disclose this trip. You didn't recuse yourself from cases involving Mr. Singer's business interests. And when questioned about it, you said you saw nothing wrong with this arrangement. Is that accurate? The smile was fading from Alito's face now. The trip was a private matter between friends. There was no obligation to disclose it. A private matter, Crockett said. Justice Alito, the estimated value of that trip was over $100,000. Mr. Singer flew you there on his private jet. You stayed at his luxury fishing lodge. You ate meals he paid for. And at the time of this trip, Mr. Singer had multiple cases that could potentially come before the court involving his hedge fund's investments. I was unaware of any specific cases. You were unaware? Crockett interrupted, her voice sharpening. Justice Alito, you're one of the most brilliant legal minds in America. You've spent your entire adult life studying the law. Are you really asking us to believe that you didn't understand how accepting a $100,000 trip from a billionaire with business before the court might create an appearance of impropriety? Alito's face was reddening now. Representative, I don't appreciate your tone. The Supreme Court has operated for over 2 centuries without Congress micromanaging our personal relationships and personal relationships, Crockett said. Let's talk about personal relationships. How many times have you met with Paul Singer? I don't see how that's relevant. How many times? I don't keep a record of social engagements. More than 5 times? Possibly. More than 10? A pause. I'd have to check. You'd have to check, Crockett said. But you're certain there's no ethical issue here. You're certain that a federal judge, a Supreme Court justice can accept tens of thousands of dollars in gifts from a billionaire who has financial interests in cases before the court, and the American people should just trust that this won't influence your decision-making. My decisions are based solely on the law and the Constitution. Justice Alito, in 2014, Paul Singer's hedge fund was involved in litigation concerning Argentine debt restructuring. That case, NML Capital v. Argentina, came before the Supreme Court. You did not recuse yourself. You voted in favor of Singer's position. The decision was worth billions of dollars to his hedge fund. And you still maintain there's no appearance of impropriety? The chamber had gone completely silent. This wasn't typical congressional questioning. This was a cross-examination, and Jasmine Crockett was a civil rights attorney who'd spent years in courtrooms breaking down evasive witnesses. Alito's face was fully flushed now. My vote in that case was based on legal principles. I'm not questioning your legal reasoning, Justice Alito. I'm questioning your judgment. I'm questioning whether a justice who accepts luxury vacations from billionaires, who refuses to recuse himself from cases involving those billionaires' financial interests, who rejects any ethics oversight, and who then lectures Congress about the importance of judicial independence, has the credibility to occupy one of the 9 most powerful positions in American government. And that's when Alito laughed. It wasn't a small chuckle or a nervous laugh. It was a full, dismissive laugh, the kind that said, "You can't be serious." It was the laugh of someone who considered the question beneath him, who found the entire line of inquiry absurd. It was the laugh of someone who knew he was untouchable and wanted everyone else to know it too. The cameras caught it. The microphones picked it up, and in that moment, Samuel Alito revealed exactly what Jasmine Crockett wanted the American people to see. Contempt. Not just disagreement or defensiveness, but pure contempt for democratic accountability, for the very idea that he should have to answer to anyone. The chamber erupted in murmurs. Other members shifted uncomfortably in their seats. The chairman looked like he wanted to intervene but wasn't sure how, and Jasmine Crockett just waited. She let the laugh hang in the air, let everyone absorb what they'd just witnessed, let Alito's mask of judicial temperament fall away completely. Then she spoke again, and her voice cut through the chaos like a scalpel. "You find this funny, Justice Alito?" He was still smiling, but it was different now, more forced. He'd realized his mistake but couldn't take it back. "Representative, I find your suggestion that I can be bought with a fishing trip to be insulting, and I never said you could be bought, Justice Alito. I said there's an appearance of impropriety. I said the American people have a right to question whether their Supreme Court justices are compromised by financial relationships with billionaires who have cases before the court. Your laugh just told them everything they need to know about how you view their concerns." 63 seconds. That's how long Jasmine Crockett's final statement took. 63 seconds that would be replayed millions of times, clipped and shared across every social media platform, analyzed by legal scholars and political commentators, and referenced in ethics debates for years to come. Here's what she said. "Justice Alito, I want to read you something. It's from the oath you took when you became a Supreme Court justice. I do solemnly swear that I will administer justice without respect to persons, and do equal right to the poor and to the rich, and that I will faithfully and impartially discharge and perform all the duties incumbent upon me under the Constitution and laws of the United States. So, help me God, without respect to persons, equal right to the poor and to the rich, faithfully and impartially." Now I want you to think about what that oath means to a single mother in my district who's working 2 jobs to keep food on the table. She can't afford a lawyer when her landlord illegally evicts her. She can't take luxury vacations. She can't fly on private jets. She can't have personal relationships with billionaires who might help her out when she's in trouble. But she believes she has to believe that when her case makes it to a courtroom, the judge will treat her fairly. That the judge won't be influenced by money or power or personal relationships. That the judge will follow the law, period. That's the promise you made when you took that oath. That's the promise every judge in America makes. And that's the promise you've broken. Not because you took a fishing trip, not because you have wealthy friends, but because you refuse to acknowledge that your conduct creates even the appearance that you might be influenced by these relationships. Because you laugh when questioned about it. Because you seem to believe that you're above the ethical standards that every other public servant in America has to follow. You're not above those standards, Justice Alito. You should be held to higher standards, because you have power that single mother will never have. You make decisions that affect whether she keeps her home, whether she can access health care, whether she can vote without jumping through discriminatory hoops. And when you laugh at questions about your ethics, you're not laughing at me, you're laughing at her. You're laughing at every American who believes that justice should be blind, that the law should apply equally to everyone, that no one, not even a Supreme Court justice, is above accountability. So I'm not asking you to resign, though I think you should. I'm not asking you to apologize, though you owe the American people one. I'm asking you to look into that camera right there and tell that single mother in my district why she should trust you. Tell her why your personal relationship with a billionaire won't affect how you rule on cases involving housing rights, worker protections, or corporate power. Tell her why she should believe in a Supreme Court that allows its justices to accept $100,000 gifts from people with business before the court. Tell her why the promise you made in your oath still means something. Because right now, Justice Alito, I don't think you can. Silence. Complete. Total. Suffocating silence. Alito's face had gone from flushed to pale. The smile was completely gone. He opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. For perhaps the first time in his judicial career, Samuel Alito had no response. The chairman, sensing the moment had passed, quickly moved to the next questioner. But no one was paying attention anymore. The hearing continued for another 2 hours, but everyone knew what the headline would be. What happened in those 63 seconds wasn't just a clever rhetorical takedown, though it was certainly that. It wasn't just a viral moment, though it became that too. It was something more fundamental. It was the voice of democratic accountability speaking truth to judicial power. It was a reminder that lifetime appointment doesn't mean freedom from criticism. It was a freshman congresswoman from Texas doing what the entire political establishment had been too timid or too deferential to do, treating a Supreme Court justice not as royalty, but as a public servant who'd failed to meet the basic ethical standards of his office. And she'd done it without raising her voice, without personal attacks, without anything that could be dismissed as partisan grandstanding. She'd simply held up a mirror and forced Alito to see what millions of Americans already saw. A compromised institution led by people who'd forgotten they served the public, not the other way around. The video went viral within minutes. By the end of the day, Jasmine Crockett was the #1 trending topic on Twitter. The clip had been viewed over 20 million times. News organizations were playing it on loop, with panels of legal experts analyzing every second. The reaction broke along predictable lines, but with some surprising crossover. Progressive activists were ecstatic. Here, finally, was someone willing to hold the Supreme Court accountable, to speak plainly about the corruption and arrogance that had poisoned the institution. Fundraising emails went out, citing Crockett's questioning. Petitions demanding Alito's resignation gained millions of signatures overnight. Conservative media figures attacked Crockett viciously. They accused her of disrespecting the court, of grandstanding, of trying to intimidate justices into ruling how progressives wanted. Some questioned whether she was smart enough to even understand the legal issues involved. Racist dog whistles that Crockett supporters immediately called out. But there was something else happening too, something more interesting. Some conservatives, particularly younger ones, and those who'd become disillusioned with the Republican Party's embrace of Trumpism, actually defended Crockett's line of questioning. They pointed out that conservative judicial philosophy supposedly emphasized ethical behavior and originalist interpretation of the Constitution, yet here was a conservative justice who seemed to believe he was above ethical scrutiny. Libertarians, already skeptical of concentrated government power, questioned why lifetime appointed judges should be immune from the kind of oversight that other officials faced. Even some establishment Republicans privately admitted that Crockett had a point, though few were willing to say so publicly. The most significant reaction, though, came from legal scholars and ethics experts. The American Bar Association released a statement noting that Alito's conduct accepting expensive gifts from individuals with business before the court without disclosure would violate ethics rules for any other federal judge and would likely result in disciplinary action. Several retired federal judges published an op-ed calling for mandatory ethics standards for Supreme Court justices, specifically citing the exchange between Crockett and Alito as evidence that voluntary compliance wasn't working. Law schools added the clip to their professional responsibility courses as an example of why ethics rules matter and what happens when powerful people believe they're exempt from them. And polling showed something remarkable. Crockett's favorability rating shot up, not just among Democrats, but among independents. Americans across the political spectrum responded to someone who was willing to speak plainly about corruption and demand accountability from the powerful. But what about Samuel Alito? In the immediate aftermath, he released a written statement through the Supreme Court's Public Information Office. It was defensive, legalistic, and entirely missed the point. He reiterated that he'd done nothing wrong, that his decisions were based solely on the law, and that Congress had no authority to impose ethics standards on the Supreme Court. He didn't address the substance of Crockett's criticism. He didn't acknowledge the appearance of impropriety. He certainly didn't apologize. If anything, his statement confirmed exactly what Crockett had accused him of, believing he was above accountability. Over the following weeks, more details about Alito's financial relationships emerged. Investigative journalists, emboldened by the attention from the hearing, dug deeper into his disclosure forms, travel records, and personal finances. They found more undisclosed trips, more expensive gifts, more connections to wealthy donors and conservative activist groups. None of it was technically illegal. Supreme Court justices aren't bound by the same disclosure requirements as other federal officials, but all of it contributed to the growing sense that Alito, and by extension the Supreme Court, had an ethics problem that couldn't be ignored. Congress moved forward with ethics reform legislation. The bill would create an enforceable code of conduct for Supreme Court justices, establish an inspector general position to investigate ethics complaints, and require detailed financial disclosures similar to what other federal officials must file. The court opposed it, of course. Chief Justice Roberts wrote a letter to Congress arguing that such legislation would violate the separation of powers and infringe on judicial independence, but the political calculus had changed. What was once a niche issue that only legal experts and progressive activists cared about had become a mainstream concern. Voters were paying attention, and politicians, even those generally supportive of the court, couldn't ignore the public demand for accountability. The legislation passed the House with bipartisan support. Its fate in the Senate remained uncertain, but even getting this far was unprecedented. And it all traced back to 63 seconds in a congressional hearing room when Jasmine Crockett refused to treat judicial arrogance with the deference it expected. But this story isn't really about one Congresswoman and one Supreme Court justice. It's about something much bigger: the crisis of legitimacy facing American institutions, and what happens when those institutions refuse to reform themselves. The Supreme Court is supposed to be above politics. That's the theory, anyway. Lifetime appointments are meant to insulate justices from political pressure, allowing them to rule based on the law and Constitution, rather than what's popular or politically expedient. It's a beautiful theory. It's also increasingly divorced from reality. The modern Supreme Court is nakedly political in ways that would have shocked earlier generations. The confirmation process has become a partisan battlefield, where nominees are chosen specifically for their ideological views and opposed based on how they're expected to rule on hot-button issues. The court's decisions increasingly break along ideological lines, with the 6 conservative justices appointed by Republican presidents reliably voting together on major issues, and the 3 liberal justices appointed by Democratic presidents reliably dissenting. The court has inserted itself into political disputes, from election procedures to gerrymandering to campaign finance, that previous courts wisely stayed out of, eroding its claim to be above politics. And as the court has become more political, its legitimacy has eroded. Polls consistently show that a majority of Americans now believe the justices rule based on their personal political views rather than impartial interpretation of the law. This crisis of legitimacy isn't abstract. It has real consequences. When people lose faith in the Supreme Court, they lose faith in the rule of law itself. If the highest court in the land is just another political institution where the powerful get favorable treatment and outcomes depend on which party appointed the majority, then why should anyone follow rulings they disagree with? This is dangerous. Democracy requires that people accept outcomes they don't like because they believe the process was fair, even if the result wasn't what they wanted. When that faith disappears, when people believe the system is rigged, democratic institutions begin to crumble. The Supreme Court's refusal to adopt meaningful ethics standards contributes directly to this crisis. When justices accept expensive gifts from billionaires, when they refuse to recuse themselves from cases involving their benefactors, when they dismiss concerns about appearances of impropriety, they tell the American people that the rules don't apply to them. And if the rules don't apply to Supreme Court justices, why should they apply to anyone else? This is what Jasmine Crockett understood and what Samuel Alito didn't. Her questioning wasn't just about one fishing trip or one justice's conduct. It was about whether American democracy can survive when its most powerful institutions believe they're above accountability. The answer, of course, is no. It can't. History is littered with republics that collapsed because elites became disconnected from the people they were supposed to serve, because institutions that were meant to protect the law instead placed themselves above it, because the powerful concluded that rules were for everyone else. Rome, Venice, countless others. The American Republic won't be destroyed by external enemies or even by the partisan polarization that dominates the news. It will be destroyed, if it is destroyed, by institutional rot, by courts that serve the powerful instead of justice, by legislators who serve donors instead of constituents, by executives who serve themselves instead of the nation. And it will be saved, if it is saved, by people like Jasmine Crockett who refuse to accept that any institution or individual is above accountability. That's why those 63 seconds mattered. Not because they changed Samuel Alito's mind. They clearly didn't. Not because they immediately reformed the Supreme Court. That process is still ongoing and its outcome uncertain. They mattered because they reminded Americans that power must be questioned, that institutions must be held accountable, and that sometimes it takes a freshman congresswoman from Texas to say what everyone's thinking, but no one else has the courage to say out loud. But there was a cost to what Jasmine Crockett did, and it's worth understanding what she risked and what she endured in the aftermath. In the days and weeks following the hearing, Crockett faced a torrent of abuse. Death threats poured into her office, requiring the Capitol Police to increase her security detail. Racist and sexist attacks flooded her social media. Conservative media figures called for her to be censured or expelled from Congress. Her district office in Dallas was vandalized. Someone spray-painted threats on the building. Staff members reported being harassed when they went out in public. This is what happens when you challenge power in America. The powerful don't just disagree with you or debate you. They try to destroy you. They unleash their media allies to discredit you. They encourage their followers to threaten and intimidate you. They use every lever of influence to make you pay for your audacity in questioning them. Crockett handled it with characteristic directness. In an interview shortly after the hearing, she was asked if she regretted her confrontation with Alito. "Regret?" she said. "The only thing I regret is that it took this long for someone to ask him these questions. The threats don't scare me. I grew up in Memphis. I went to law school while working full-time. I fought cases against powerful corporations and won. You think a few angry tweets are going to make me back down from holding a Supreme Court justice accountable for his conduct?" She paused, then added, "The people who are attacking me aren't upset because I was wrong. They're upset because I was right. They're upset because I said the quiet part out loud. They're upset because for 63 seconds, they couldn't hide behind legalese and precedent and the mystique of the Supreme Court. They had to defend the indefensible, and they couldn't do it. But there was a toll, even if Crockett wouldn't admit it publicly. Staff members reported that she worked even longer hours than before, arriving at the office before dawn and leaving long after dark. She increased her security protocols, varying her routes to and from work, checking her car before getting in. She also became more isolated in Congress. Some of her Democratic colleagues, particularly older members who valued institutional relationships, quietly suggested she'd gone too far, that attacking a Supreme Court justice so directly was counterproductive. One senior Democrat was quoted anonymously in a Politico article saying, "She made her point, but she also made it harder for those of us trying to work with the conservative justices on other issues. There's a way to do things in Washington, and grandstanding in a hearing isn't it?" Crockett's response to that quote, delivered in a floor speech, was characteristically blunt. "I've been told I don't do things the Washington way, that I'm too aggressive, too confrontational, too unwilling to play nice with people who are destroying the institutions they're supposed to protect. Good. The Washington way gave us a Supreme Court where justices can accept $100,000 gifts from billionaires without consequences. The Washington way gave us a political system where corporations have more rights than people and money is speech. The Washington way gave us decades of politicians promising change while protecting the status quo. My constituents didn't send me here to play nice. They sent me here to fight for them. And if that means some people in this chamber are uncomfortable with my questions or my tone, they can vote me out in 2 years. That's how democracy works. But until then, I'm going to keep asking the questions that need to be asked. I'm going to keep demanding accountability from people who think they're above it. And I'm not going to apologize for refusing to treat corruption with respect just because it comes dressed in a judge's robes." The speech went viral too, of course. Crockett had become something more than just a congresswoman. She'd become a symbol of a particular kind of politics. Confrontational, uncompromising, willing to say what others wouldn't. Some people loved it. Others hated it. No one could ignore it. While the political drama played out, legal scholars were grappling with the substantive questions Crockett had raised. Was there actually an ethics problem at the Supreme Court? And if so, what could be done about it? The answer to the first question was increasingly clear: yes. A comprehensive study by the Center for Responsive Politics found that Supreme Court justices had accepted millions of dollars worth of gifts, travel, and hospitality over the previous decade, with most of it coming from individuals and organizations with ideological interests in how the court ruled on major cases. Conservative justices had accepted luxury trips and gifts from conservative activists and donors. Liberal justices had accepted speaking fees and accommodations from progressive organizations. The practice was bipartisan, though the amounts involved tended to be larger on the conservative side. None of it violated any rules, because there weren't any meaningful rules governing Supreme Court justices' conduct. Federal district and appellate judges are bound by the Code of Conduct for United States judges, which includes detailed provisions about recusal, financial disclosure, and acceptance of gifts. Violations can result in disciplinary action, including removal from cases or even impeachment in extreme circumstances. But Supreme Court justices aren't covered by this code. They're expected to self-regulate based on general principles of judicial ethics, but there's no enforcement mechanism and no consequences for violations. This was the system that Samuel Alito defended. This was what he'd laughed about when questioned, and legal scholars increasingly agreed it was indefensible. A group of constitutional law professors from across the ideological spectrum published an open letter calling for Congress to enact binding ethics standards for Supreme Court justices. They argued that nothing in the Constitution prevented such legislation, and that the court's historical independence didn't require freedom from basic ethical oversight. Even some conservative legal scholars, traditionally protective of judicial independence, began to acknowledge the problem. One prominent originalist wrote an essay arguing that the founders would have been horrified by the modern court's ethics practices, and that lifetime appointment was meant to protect judicial independence, not to create an aristocracy of unaccountable judges. But here's where things got complicated. Even if Congress passed ethics reform legislation, could it actually be enforced? The Supreme Court would undoubtedly be asked to rule on the constitutionality of any such law, and the same justices whose conduct the law was meant to regulate would be the ones deciding whether it was constitutional. It's not hard to guess how that would go. This is the fundamental problem with trying to reform institutions from within. The people who benefit from the current system are the ones with the power to block reforms. It's not a coincidence. It's by design. So legal scholars began discussing more radical solutions. Term limits for Supreme Court justices, which would require a constitutional amendment, but would end the problem of justices serving for decades, regardless of their conduct or competence. Expansion of the court to dilute the influence of the current majority. Jurisdictional limitations that would prevent the court from hearing certain types of cases. All of these ideas had significant problems and faced enormous political obstacles. But they were being discussed seriously for the first time in generations, because the status quo had become untenable. And the reason it had become untenable, the reason these discussions were happening at all, was because Jasmine Crockett had spent 63 seconds exposing the rot at the heart of America's highest court. The confrontation between Crockett and Alito became more than just a political moment. It became a cultural phenomenon that revealed deep fault lines in how Americans think about power, accountability, and who gets to question authority. Within days, the clip had been remixed, analyzed, and transformed into dozens of different formats. TikTok creators made reaction videos. YouTube essayists produced hour-long breakdowns of the legal and political implications. Meme accounts turned Alito's laugh into a symbol of out-of-touch elitism. But the most interesting cultural response came from an unexpected place. Young people who'd never paid much attention to the Supreme Court suddenly started asking questions. High school civics teachers reported that students were bringing up the Crockett-Alito exchange in class discussions. College students packed law school forums about judicial ethics. Social media was flooded with young people researching Supreme Court decisions, reading about previous ethics scandals, and discovering for the first time just how much power these 9 unelected individuals wielded over their lives. One viral TikTok from a 9-year-old college student captured the mood. So you're telling me that 9 people I never voted for, who serve until they die or decide to quit, can decide whether I have the right to an abortion, whether my vote counts, whether corporations can pollute my water, whether I can be discriminated against at work. And they can take $100,000 vacations from billionaires who have cases before them. And there's nothing we can do about it? And I'm just supposed to trust that they're impartial? Are you kidding me right now? The video got 14 million views and spawned thousands of response videos, mostly from other young people expressing similar outrage and disbelief. This was significant because it represented a generational shift in how Americans viewed the Supreme Court. Older generations, even those who disagreed with specific decisions, generally maintained a baseline respect for the institution. The court was special, above politics, deserving of deference. Younger Americans, shaped by decades of watching institutions fail them, economic crashes caused by Wall Street greed, climate change ignored by politicians, student debt crushing their futures, healthcare systems that bankrupted families had no such deference to give. They looked at the Supreme Court and saw another broken institution captured by wealthy elites, and Jasmine Crockett's confrontation with Samuel Alito confirmed what they already suspected. The system wasn't designed to work for them. This generational divide played out in fascinating ways across the culture. Late-night comedy shows made Crockett's questioning a central topic. Trevor Noah devoted an entire segment to it, praising Crockett's directness and mocking Alito's laugh. That laugh, Noah said, was the sound of someone who's never had to worry about consequences. That's not the laugh of a judge. That's the laugh of someone who knows they can't be fired, can't be voted out, and will have their job until they die. That's the laugh of a king, not a public servant. Saturday Night Live did a sketch parodying the hearing, with the actress playing Crockett gradually growing more exasperated as the actor playing Alito became more dismissive, until she finally broke the fourth wall and addressed the audience. Y'all see this, right? This is what we're dealing with. 9 people with lifetime appointments who answer to no one. And we wonder why nothing changes. But conservative media pushed back hard, and their response revealed something important about the cultural battle lines being drawn. Fox News ran segments accusing Crockett of attacking the Supreme Court and undermining judicial independence. One host said, "This is what happens when you elect radicals to Congress. They don't respect our institutions. They don't understand the Constitution. They just want to tear everything down." Conservative talk radio was even more vitriolic. Rush Limbaugh's replacement on his former show spent 3 hours attacking Crockett, questioning her intelligence, suggesting she'd only been elected because of affirmative action, and warning that Democrats were trying to pack the court by first destroying its legitimacy. The attacks were nakedly racist and sexist, barely coded language that anyone paying attention could decode. A black woman had dared to challenge a white male Supreme Court justice, and certain segments of America couldn't tolerate it. But something interesting happened. These attacks largely backfired. Younger viewers, even conservative ones, found the defenses of Alito unconvincing. Polls showed that while older Republicans strongly supported Alito and opposed ethics reforms, Republicans under 40 were much more evenly split. Many acknowledged that accepting expensive gifts from billionaires was wrong regardless of which party the justice belonged to. This generational divide within conservatism was new and potentially transformative. For decades, young conservatives had largely followed older conservatives on judicial issues. But the Crockett-Alito confrontation exposed a gap between those who viewed the court as a sacred institution deserving automatic deference and those who viewed it as just another part of government that should be held accountable. The cultural impact extended beyond politics and media. Artists started incorporating the moment into their work. A prominent muralist in Philadelphia created a piece showing Crockett standing before a crumbling Supreme Court building, her finger pointed at cracks in the foundation. The text read, "Democracy dies when we stop asking questions." A playwright in New York announced she was writing a one-act play based on the 63-second exchange, exploring themes of power, accountability, and institutional decay. Musicians referenced it in lyrics. Poets wrote about it. It became a touchstone moment, a cultural reference point that people used to talk about larger issues of justice and corruption. And through all of this, Jasmine Crockett herself remained focused on the work. She introduced legislation to create ethics standards for Supreme Court justices. She organized town halls in her district to educate constituents about the court's role and power. She continued her committee work, asking tough questions and refusing to accept non-answers. In interviews, she consistently downplayed her own role in creating the viral moment. "This isn't about me," she said in one interview. "This is about accountability. This is about whether we still believe that no one is above the law. I'm just a congresswoman from Texas doing my job." The fact that asking a Supreme Court justice about his ethics has become controversial tells you everything you need to know about how far we've fallen. But whether she wanted it or not, Crockett had become a symbol of resistance to institutional corruption, a symbol of speaking truth to power, a symbol of a new generation of leaders who refused to accept that things had to stay the way they'd always been. Beneath all the political drama and cultural warfare, there was a genuine constitutional question that needed answering. Can Congress regulate the Supreme Court's ethics? Legal scholars were divided, and their divisions didn't follow the usual ideological lines. Some originalists argued that Congress clearly had the power to regulate the court. Article 3 of the Constitution gives Congress broad authority over the federal judiciary, including the power to establish courts, set their jurisdiction, and regulate their procedures. The first Congress, which included many of the Constitution's framers, passed the Judiciary Act of 1789, which established the structure and procedures of federal courts, including the Supreme Court. If the founders intended for the Supreme Court to be completely independent of congressional oversight, these scholars argued they would have said so explicitly. Instead, they gave Congress significant power over the judicial branch. Other originalists countered that while Congress could regulate lower federal courts, the Supreme Court occupied a unique constitutional position. The court's independence was essential to its role as a check on the other branches. Allowing Congress to impose ethics standards on justices would give Congress leverage over the court's decision-making, violating the separation of powers. Progressive legal scholars generally supported congressional authority to impose ethics standards, but for different reasons. They argued that the Constitution was a living document that should be interpreted in light of modern realities. The founders couldn't have anticipated a world where justices served for 30-plus years, where billionaires could effectively purchase influence through luxury gifts, where partisan polarization made the court's legitimacy so fragile. In this modern context, congressional oversight of judicial ethics was necessary to preserve the court's independence and legitimacy, not to undermine it. Conservative legal scholars warned that any congressional ethics legislation was a Trojan horse for court packing and other schemes to control the court's decisions. Today it would be ethics standards. Tomorrow it would be ideological litmus tests. Better to maintain the status quo and trust justices to regulate themselves. But this debate wasn't purely academic. It had immediate practical implications. The ethics reform bill that passed the House included several key provisions. First, it would create a binding code of conduct for Supreme Court justices, based on the existing code for lower federal judges. This would establish clear rules about gift acceptance, financial disclosure, and recusal requirements. Second, it would create an Office of Judicial Ethics within the judicial branch, headed by an Inspector General appointed by the Chief Justice with Senate confirmation. This office would investigate ethics complaints and issue public reports on its findings. Third, it would strengthen financial disclosure requirements, closing loopholes that allowed justices to avoid reporting certain types of gifts and income. Fourth, it would establish a recusal procedure. When a justice's participation in a case was challenged on ethics grounds, the other 8 justices would vote on whether recusal was required. This would prevent individual justices from deciding for themselves whether they had conflicts of interest. The legislation specifically stated that it was not designed to influence the court's decisions, only to ensure that justices adhered to the same ethical standards as other public servants. But when the bill reached the Senate, it faced a filibuster threat from Republicans who argued it was unconstitutional. They insisted that only the court itself could establish ethics standards for justices, and that any congressional attempt to do so would violate the separation of powers. The Democratic leadership faced a choice: eliminate the filibuster for this legislation, which would allow passage with a simple majority, but would set a precedent with unpredictable consequences, or negotiate with moderate Republicans to try to get 60 votes. They chose negotiation. After weeks of closed-door discussions, a compromise emerged. The ethics code would be largely voluntary, with the Inspector General position downgraded to an advisory role. The financial disclosure requirements would be strengthened, but enforcement would remain minimal. The recusal procedure would be recommended, but not required. In other words, the bill had been gutted. It would create the appearance of reform while changing very little about how the Supreme Court actually operated. Progressive activists were furious. They'd seen this movie before. Public outrage leads to reform legislation, which gets watered down in negotiations, until what passes is a symbolic gesture that leaves the underlying problems untouched. Jasmine Crockett was one of the few members of Congress willing to say publicly what many were thinking privately. In a floor speech opposing the compromise bill, she said, "We had a chance to do something real. We had a chance to restore public faith in the Supreme Court by holding its members to the same standards we hold every other public servant in America. Instead, we're passing a bill that asks justices to pretty please follow ethics guidelines if they feel like it, and creates an inspector general with no power to actually investigate or enforce anything. This isn't reform. This is theater. This is Congress pretending to do something while actually protecting the status quo. And the saddest part is that we're doing this because we're afraid. We're afraid the Supreme Court will strike down real ethics reform as unconstitutional. We're afraid of what conservative media will say. We're afraid of standing up to power. But here's what we should be afraid of. We should be afraid of what happens when Americans lose faith in their institutions. We should be afraid of what happens when people believe the system is rigged and there's no way to fix it. We should be afraid of what happens when a Supreme Court justice can laugh at questions about his ethics because he knows there will be no consequences. That's what we should be afraid of. And this bill does nothing to address it. She voted against the compromise. So did about 40 other progressives in the House. But the bill passed anyway and was signed into law. Press releases went out celebrating the historic ethics reform. Editorial boards praised Congress for taking action. And nothing fundamentally changed. Samuel Alito continued serving on the Supreme Court. He continued accepting expensive gifts from wealthy benefactors. He continued refusing to recuse himself from cases involving those benefactors' interests. The only difference was that now there was a law on the books saying he shouldn't do these things. A law with no enforcement mechanism and no consequences for violations. The failure of meaningful ethics reform revealed something important about modern American democracy. The system has become very good at absorbing and neutralizing challenges to power. This wasn't unique to the Supreme Court ethics issue. It was a pattern that repeated across virtually every attempt at systemic reform. After the 2008 financial crisis caused by Wall Street's reckless behavior, there was massive public outrage. Congress passed the Dodd-Frank Act, which was supposed to prevent future crashes by regulating banks more strictly. But the law was filled with loopholes. The regulations it required were delayed, weakened, and in some cases never implemented. Banks hired armies of lobbyists to water down enforcement. Within a few years, many of Dodd-Frank's key provisions had been repealed or made toothless. The bankers who'd crashed the economy faced no criminal charges. The executives who'd made millions while their institutions collapsed kept their wealth. And the next financial crisis remained inevitable because the fundamental problems were never addressed. After multiple mass shootings sparked national conversations about gun violence, there was overwhelming public support for common-sense gun reforms like universal background checks. Poll after poll showed 80–90% of Americans, including gun owners, supported such measures. But nothing passed. The gun lobby was too powerful. Politicians were too afraid of losing NRA endorsements and donations. So instead of reform, Americans got thoughts and prayers and empty promises that this time would be different. After numerous police killings of unarmed black people sparked the largest protest movement in American history, there were calls for fundamental police reform. demilitarization, accountability, training, investment in alternatives to police response for mental health and other non-violent situations. Some cities made changes, some police departments reformed their policies. But the national legislation that was supposed to address these issues stalled in Congress. The George Floyd Justice in Policing Act passed the House but died in the Senate. Negotiations over a compromise bill collapsed when neither side would give ground on qualified immunity. The pattern was the same every time. Public outrage, calls for reform, legislation introduced, intense lobbying and political pressure. The bill gets watered down or killed. Symbolic changes are made. The fundamental problems remain. And the people who caused the problems in the first place continue in power, wealthier, and more entrenched than ever. This was what Jasmine Crockett was up against. Not just Samuel Alito, not just a corrupt Supreme Court, but an entire system designed to protect itself from accountability. In a podcast interview several months after the hearing, Crockett reflected on this dynamic. People ask me if I'm discouraged that the ethics bill didn't do what we wanted it to do. And yeah, of course I'm disappointed, but I'm not surprised. This is how the system works. Those in power use that power to protect themselves. That's not a bug. It's a feature. But here's the thing. Change doesn't happen because one person gives one good speech or asks the right questions in one hearing. Change happens when enough people get angry enough to demand it and refuse to accept symbolic gestures instead of real reform. What happened with me and Justice Alito? That was one moment. But it's part of a larger movement of people who are done accepting that things have to be this way. Young people especially. They're not buying the excuses anymore. They're not satisfied with incremental change. They want fundamental transformation. And they're right. The system is broken. The institutions that are supposed to protect us are corrupt. The people with power use it to enrich themselves and their friends, and those of us in government who are trying to fix it are fighting against every lever of power those people control. So yeah, we didn't get the ethics reform we wanted, but we started a conversation. We changed what people expect from their Supreme Court. We made it harder for justices to just brush off questions about their conduct. That's not nothing. It's not enough, but it's not nothing. She paused, then added, "The real question is whether Americans will keep paying attention. Whether they'll remember this when they vote. Whether they'll support candidates who actually want to reform the system rather than just tinker around the edges. Because the thing about power is, it doesn't give itself up voluntarily. It has to be taken, and that requires sustained pressure from people who refuse to be distracted or bought off, or convinced that incremental change is the best we can hope for. I don't know if we're there yet as a country, but I know we're closer than we were before. And I know that every time someone in power laughs at questions about their ethics, they're showing the American people who they really are. Eventually, enough people will see it. And when they do, things will change. Real change, not symbolic change. A year after the confrontation, the impact of those 63 seconds was still being felt in unexpected ways. Law school applications surged, with many applicants citing Crockett's questioning as inspiration for wanting to study law. One applicant wrote in her personal statement, "I watched Representative Crockett dismantle Justice Alito's defenses in 63 seconds. And I realized that's what law should be about, not protecting the powerful, but holding them accountable. That's the kind of lawyer I want to be." Dozens of similar statements were reported by admissions officers at top law schools. A generation of future lawyers had been inspired not by watching legal titans argue before the Supreme Court, but by watching a Congresswoman expose judicial corruption. The phrase 63 seconds entered the political lexicon. When other members of Congress gave particularly effective questionings in hearings, commentators would compare them to Crockett's 63 seconds. It became a standard, a benchmark for what real accountability looked like. Political candidates started modeling their campaign messages on Crockett's directness. Instead of the usual consultant-approved talking points that said nothing controversial, more candidates started speaking plainly about corruption and the need for systemic change. It didn't always work. Voters are complicated, and directness doesn't automatically translate to victory. But it represented a shift in political communication. a recognition that people were tired of politicians who talked around issues instead of addressing them head-on. The impact was also felt within the Supreme Court itself, though the justices would never publicly admit it. According to clerks who leaked information to journalists, the court's internal dynamics had changed after the Crockett-Alito confrontation. There was more tension, more concern about public perception, more discussion about ethics issues. Some justices started declining expensive gifts or trips that they previously would have accepted without hesitation, not because they'd suddenly discovered ethics, but because they didn't want to be the next target of viral questioning. Chief Justice Roberts reportedly increased pressure on his colleagues to adopt a voluntary code of conduct, warning that if the court didn't police itself, Congress would eventually force the issue regardless of the constitutional implications. This led to the court finally adopting its first ever written ethics code. It was weaker than what Congress had proposed, with no enforcement mechanism and lots of vague language that gave justices wide discretion. But it was something, which was more than had existed before. Legal scholars noted the irony. The court had resisted ethics standards for decades, insisting they were unnecessary. But when public pressure mounted after Crockett's questioning, suddenly the court decided voluntary standards might be a good idea after all. It was a tacit admission that the criticism had been valid. The court wouldn't phrase it that way, of course, but anyone paying attention understood what had happened. Jasmine Crockett had forced change through the power of exposure and public pressure. Meanwhile, Crockett herself had become one of the most prominent members of Congress. She was frequently mentioned as a possible future senator or even presidential candidate. Her fundraising was enormous. Her social media following dwarfed that of most senators, but she remained focused on the work rather than the celebrity. She continued serving on her committees, asking tough questions, introducing legislation that challenged powerful interests. She held regular town halls in her district, staying connected to the people who'd elected her. She mentored younger activists and first-time candidates, sharing what she'd learned about navigating the political system while maintaining your principles. In a speech at a progressive conference, she addressed her newfound prominence. People keep asking me about that moment with Justice Alito. They want to know if I planned it, if I knew it would go viral, if I was nervous. The truth is, I didn't plan anything except doing my job. My job is to represent my constituents and hold powerful people accountable. That's it. That's what they elected me to do. The fact that doing my job became viral news tells you how rarely it actually happens. We've gotten so used to politicians who won't challenge power, who are afraid of making waves, who care more about their next election than doing what's right. So, when someone actually does challenge power, actually asks the tough questions, actually refuses to accept BS answers, it seems revolutionary. But it shouldn't be. It should be normal. And my hope is that a few years from now, what I did won't seem special anymore. My hope is that there will be hundreds of elected officials asking those kinds of questions, demanding that level of accountability, refusing to let the powerful hide behind their institutions. Because that's the only way we fix this. Not through one viral moment, not through one person, but through a sustained movement of people committed to real accountability and real change. The audience gave her a standing ovation, but Crockett's expression remained serious as she continued. I also want to be real with you about something. What I did was the easy part. Asking tough questions in a hearing, that takes preparation and courage, but it's not that hard. The hard part is what comes after. The hard part is passing legislation that actually reforms broken systems. The hard part is overcoming the lobbying, the special interests, the millions of dollars spent to maintain the status quo. The hard part is sustaining public attention long enough to force real change. That's where we usually fail. We have the viral moment, we have the outrage, but then people move on to the next thing, and nothing fundamentally changes. So if you really want to honor what happened in that hearing room, don't just share the clip. Don't just make memes. Actually get involved. Vote in every election, especially primaries. Support candidates who will challenge power. Hold your own representatives accountable when they sell out or back down. Because the Samuel Alitos of the world are counting on you to lose interest. They're counting on the system to absorb and neutralize your anger. They're counting on being able to wait you out. Don't let them. The confrontation between Jasmine Crockett and Samuel Alito represented something larger than one Congresswoman and one justice. It represented a fundamental tension in American democracy between accountability and independence, between democratic pressure and institutional insulation. The founders designed the Supreme Court to be insulated from public opinion. They gave justices lifetime tenure specifically so they wouldn't have to worry about pleasing voters or politicians. The idea was that this independence would allow them to rule based on the law and constitution rather than what was popular. It was a reasonable idea in theory. In practice, it created a class of officials with enormous power and virtually no accountability. And as America has become more polarized, as the stakes of Supreme Court decisions have grown higher, as justices have served longer, this lack of accountability has become increasingly problematic. Think about what it means to have lifetime tenure in the modern world. When the Constitution was written, life expectancy was much lower. Justices might serve for 10 to 15 years before dying. Now they routinely serve for 20 to 30 years or more. Justice William O. Douglas served for 36 years. Stephen Breyer served for 28 years. Clarence Thomas has been on the court for over 30 years and shows no signs of retiring. This means that a justice appointed at age 50 could still be making decisions affecting American law. When they're 80 or 85, they could be shaping the legal landscape for Americans who weren't even born when they were confirmed. And throughout that entire time, there's virtually no mechanism to hold them accountable for ethical violations, conflicts of interest, or even diminished capacity due to age. The system assumes that justices will regulate themselves, that they'll voluntarily maintain high ethical standards, that they'll recuse themselves when appropriate, that they'll retire when they can no longer effectively do the job. But what happens when those assumptions prove false? This was the question Jasmine Crockett forced America to confront. And the answer was uncomfortable. When the assumptions prove false, there's no backup plan. The system breaks down, and there's no way to fix it without either constitutional amendment or fundamental restructuring of the court. Constitutional amendments require 2/3 of both houses of Congress and ratification by 3/4 of states. This is virtually impossible in modern polarized America. The last amendment was ratified in 1992, and it was about congressional pay, not a controversial issue. Restructuring the court, adding justices, imposing term limits through legislation, stripping jurisdiction over certain issues is theoretically possible with simple congressional majorities. But it would be seen as court packing and would likely face its own constitutional challenges. So we're stuck. We have a system that doesn't work, but changing it seems impossible. And meanwhile, the court continues making decisions that profoundly affect American life, handed down by justices who are accountable to no one. This is what political scientists call a democratic crisis. Not the dramatic kind where tanks roll through streets, but the slower, more insidious kind where institutions gradually lose legitimacy and there's no clear path to reform. And it's not just the Supreme Court. Congress has an approval rating below 20%. The presidency has become increasingly imperial, with both parties expanding executive power when their candidate wins. State legislatures are often gerrymandered to the point where elections are meaningless. Money dominates politics at every level. American democracy is straining under the weight of its own contradictions. And what happened in that hearing room was a small symptom of a much larger disease. Jasmine Crockett understood this. In a long-form interview with The Atlantic, she spoke about her view of America's democratic crisis. People want to know if I think American democracy is in danger. And the answer is yes, obviously. But not for the reasons most people think. The danger isn't some dramatic coup or stolen election, though those are real concerns. The danger is that more and more Americans are concluding that the system doesn't work for them, that it's rigged in favor of the wealthy and powerful, and that voting and participating in democracy won't actually change anything. And you know what? They're not wrong. The system is rigged, not in some conspiracy theory way, but in the obvious, structural way where money buys access and influence, where powerful interests write the laws that regulate them, where Supreme Court justices can take luxury vacations from billionaires without consequences. When people lose faith in democratic institutions, they stop participating. And when they stop participating, those institutions become even more captured by elite interests. It's a vicious cycle. Breaking that cycle requires two things. First, we need real reforms that make the system more democratic and more accountable. That means things like ethics standards for the Supreme Court, but also campaign finance reform, voting rights protection, reducing the influence of money in politics, all of it. Second, we need people to believe change is possible. That's the harder part, because people have been promised change before and been disappointed. They've seen politicians talk a good game and then sell out. They've watched movements peter out when they run into institutional resistance. So when I asked those questions in that hearing, I wasn't just trying to embarrass Justice Alito, though I'm not sorry that happened. I was trying to show people that it's still possible to challenge power. That representatives can actually represent their constituents instead of protecting the establishment. Did it change everything? No. Did it fix the Supreme Court's ethics problems? Obviously not. But did it maybe convince a few more people that fighting is worth it? That change is possible if enough of us demand it? I hope so. Because that's all any of us can do, keep fighting and hope that eventually we reach a tipping point.